The glass doors of First National Trust Bank opened automatically as Margaret stepped inside, bringing with her a gust of warm afternoon air. She paused just inside the entrance, letting her eyes adjust from the bright sunlight to the cooler, dimmer interior. The bank looked like every other bank she'd ever been in. Clean floors, a few potted plants that probably got watered once a week, and that particular smell of air conditioning mixed with printer toner. It was a Tuesday just after 2 in the afternoon. Not the lunch rush, not the end-of-day crowd, just a handful of people scattered around the lobby, most of them looking at their phones while they waited. Margaret was 52, though people often told her she looked younger. She'd worn her favorite navy pantsuit today. Nothing fancy, just something comfortable and professional. Her briefcase was old, the leather worn soft at the corners from years of use. She'd bought it back when she was starting out in business, and even though it looked a bit tired now, she couldn't bring herself to replace it. Too many memories. She joined the short line at the teller windows, standing behind an older gentleman in a polo shirt who was chatting away about his grandson's little league team. The teller, a young woman named Stephanie according to her name tag, was smiling and nodding as she processed his deposit. And then he hit it right over the fence, the man was saying. You should have seen his face. That's wonderful, Stephanie said warmly. You must be so proud. Margaret watched the easy exchange, the casual friendliness of it. The man finished up and walked away whistling, giving Margaret a polite nod as he passed. Good afternoon, Margaret said as she stepped up to the window, setting her briefcase down on the counter. Hi there, Stephanie replied, though Margaret noticed the smile was a bit more professional now, less genuine. How can I help you? I'd like to make a deposit, please. Sure thing. Can I get your account number? Margaret recited it from memory. She'd opened this account 2 weeks ago, coming into this very branch to set it up. A simple checking account with a $500 starting deposit, nothing unusual about it. While Stephanie typed, pulling up the account on her computer, Margaret reached into her briefcase. Her fingers found the envelope she'd tucked in there this morning, and she pulled out the check inside. It was a business check. Clean, professional, printed on good paper stock. Williams Property Management, it said across the top. The amount was $47,000. Payment for a commercial building she'd sold last month in Philadelphia. Margaret slid the check across the counter. Stephanie picked it up, glanced at it, and her whole demeanor changed in an instant. Her eyes went wide. She looked at the check, then at Margaret, then back at the check again. Oh, Stephanie said quietly. This is quite a lot. It's a business deposit, Margaret said evenly. She'd been through this before, more times than she cared to count. From my property management company. Stephanie was still staring at the check like it might disappear if she blinked. Right, okay, so Williams Property Management, you own that? Yes, I do. Okay. The young woman set the check down carefully, almost gingerly. I'm really sorry, but for an amount this large, I need to get my manager. It's just policy. I'll be right back. She didn't wait for Margaret to respond. Stephanie turned and walked quickly toward the back of the bank, toward a row of offices with glass walls. Margaret could see her approach a man in a dark suit, expensive-looking, the kind with a subtle pinstripe. He was maybe in his mid-40s with brown hair slicked back and a watch that caught the overhead lights. The man looked up as Stephanie approached. Even from where she stood, Margaret could see him straighten in his chair, his expression shifting into something more serious. He stood up and said something to Stephanie, who nodded rapidly. Then he started walking toward the teller counter. Margaret had been in business for over 30 years. She'd built a real estate portfolio from nothing, starting with a single duplex she'd bought with every penny she could scrape together. She'd weathered recessions, market crashes, and more than her share of people who'd underestimated her. She knew how to read a room, how to read people. And right now, watching this manager stride across the lobby floor, she could read exactly what was about to happen. The man didn't smile as he approached, didn't introduce himself. His name tag said Derek Patterson, branch manager. He reached across the counter without a word and picked up Margaret's check. Holding it up to examine it, ma'am, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made the word sound less like respect and more like dismissal. Where exactly did you get this check? Margaret kept her voice calm and professional. It's payment from my company, Williams Property Management. As I was explaining to your teller, Derek made a sound in his throat. Not quite a laugh, but close. He turned the check over, held it up to the light, squinted at the signature line. He was making a show of it, Margaret realized. Performing his skepticism for anyone watching, and people were watching. His voice had been loud enough that a few customers in the waiting area had looked up, curious about what was happening. "This seems pretty irregular to me," Derek announced. "Still loud, still performing. A check this size." "I assure you it's completely legitimate," Margaret said. "If you'd like to verify it, the phone number for Williams Property Management is printed right there on the check. You're welcome to call." Derek wasn't looking at the phone number. He was looking at Margaret. His eyes traveled from her worn briefcase to her department store suit, to her simple hairstyle and back again. She could see him making calculations, drawing conclusions. "I'm going to need to see multiple forms of ID," he said. Margaret had expected this. She pulled out her driver's license and passport, sliding them across the counter. More identification than any normal transaction would require, but she handed them over without complaint. Derek picked them up slowly, examining each one like he was looking for hidden flaws. He spent what felt like a full minute comparing her passport photo to her face, as if checking whether she might be using someone else's documents. At the window next to them, Margaret noticed another customer, a white woman around her age, maybe a little older. She was depositing what looked like a fairly large check, too. The teller processed it quickly, smiled, said, "Have a wonderful day," and that was that. No manager needed, no verification required. Margaret turned her attention back to Derek, who was still holding her passport. "So this company," he said, tapping the check with his finger, "Williams Property Management. You're saying you own this?" "Yes. And how long have you owned it?" 23 years. "Uh-huh." Derek set her passport down and crossed his arms. "And what does this company do exactly?" Margaret wondered if he interrogated every customer like this. Something told her he didn't. "We manage residential and commercial properties, apartment complexes, office buildings, retail space. We also handle property acquisitions and sales." "Right." He picked up the check again. "And you're telling me a check for $47,000 is normal for you?" "It's not unusual, no. That's payment for a commercial property I sold." Derek shook his head slowly, like he was dealing with a child who'd told him an unbelievable story. "Look, ma'am, I have to be honest with you. I'm not comfortable processing this today." There it was. Margaret had known it was coming, had seen it building through the entire conversation. But hearing him actually say it still sent a small jolt of anger through her chest. She took a quiet breath, keeping it under control. "Can you tell me why?" she asked. "Why?" Derek's eyebrows went up like the answer was obvious. "Because frankly, I'm not convinced this is actually your check." Behind him, Stephanie shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. Margaret kept her voice level. "The check is made out to me. You have my identification right there in front of you. You can verify the check's legitimacy with one phone call. So what's the actual problem here?" Derek's face flushed red. "The problem is that I have a responsibility to protect this bank from fraud. When someone walks in off the street with a check this size, with a story that doesn't quite add up, I have to ask questions." "What part of my story doesn't add up?" "The whole thing," Derek said, gesturing vaguely. "In my experience, when people come in trying to deposit checks like this, there's usually something going on." "Some kind of scam? People like me, you mean?" Margaret asked quietly. Derek caught himself, seemed to realize he was on thin ice. "People I don't have an established relationship with. People who don't seem to understand banking procedures. People who—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "People who raise red flags." It was impressive, in a way, how he could insult her without saying anything explicitly wrong. Every word technically defensible. Every implication clear as day. "I've been banking for 30 years, Margaret said. "I understand banking procedures just fine. What I don't understand is why you won't do your job and verify this check." The red in Derek's face deepened to crimson. "Ma'am, you need to lower your voice." Margaret hadn't raised her voice. She'd spoken in exactly the same calm, measured tone she'd been using the entire time. But Derek had found his excuse. "Stephanie," he said sharply, not taking his eyes off Margaret. "Call security. Have them escort her to the waiting area while we verify all this information." The security guard who approached was an older man, probably close to retirement age. He looked profoundly uncomfortable with the situation, apologetic even as he gestured toward the waiting area. Margaret could have argued, could have demanded to speak to someone above Derek, could have made a scene that would echo through this branch for weeks. But she didn't. Instead, she smiled. Just a small smile, but something about it seemed to unsettle Derek more than any argument would have. "Of course," she said quietly. "I'll wait." She gathered her identification. Derek was still holding her check and followed the security guard to the plastic chairs lined up against the wall. As she sat down, she noticed the other customers quickly looking away, suddenly very interested in their phones. Margaret pulled out her own phone, but not to call a lawyer or lodge a complaint. She opened her calendar app and made a quick note. Branch 5, downtown location. Derek Patterson. Immediate attention required. Then she put the phone away and settled in to wait. Through the glass walls of his office, she could see Derek on the phone, gesturing animatedly. He wasn't calling Williams Property Management to verify the check. She would have bet money on that. He was probably calling someone to brag about catching what he thought was attempted fraud, playing the hero who protected the bank. The security guard hovered nearby, looking miserable.
"Can I get you some water or anything?"
he asked quietly. "No, thank you," Margaret said. "I'm fine." And she was fine. Patient. Calm. Observing. Because here's what Derek Patterson didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know. 3 months ago, Margaret Williams had purchased this bank. Not just this branch. The entire First National Trust Bank, every location, every asset, every employee contract. She'd done it quietly, through a private equity firm she controlled, with layers of lawyers handling the paperwork. The previous owners had been eager to sell. The bank had been struggling for years, losing ground to bigger national chains. But Margaret saw potential. She believed in community banking, in institutions that served real people in real neighborhoods. Before she announced herself as the new owner, though, she'd wanted to see how the bank really operated. Wanted to experience it the way regular customers experienced it, so she'd been visiting each branch one by one, just another customer walking through the door. 4 branches down, 1 to go after this. 2 had been good. Friendly staff, reasonable service. 1 had been excellent. 1 had been mediocre, and this one? This one was going to require some significant changes. Margaret checked the time. She'd been sitting here for 20 minutes now. Across the lobby, Derek was still in his office, still on the phone. He'd glance her way occasionally, probably checking to make sure she was still there. She was in no hurry. 30 minutes passed. Then 45. Other customers came and went. The woman at the next window finished her deposit and left. A young couple opened a joint account. An older man cashed a check without anyone questioning him. Margaret sat and watched it all. Finally, after an hour and a half, Derek emerged from his office. He walked across the lobby with a satisfied expression on his face, like someone who'd just won an argument. When he reached the waiting area, he stood over Margaret, holding her check and identification. "Ma'am," he said, and there was something triumphant in his voice. "I've made the decision that we cannot process this transaction today. I'm going to have to ask you to take your business elsewhere." He held out her check and ID like he was handing her a piece of trash. Margaret stood slowly, taking her documents back. "You won't process a legitimate check from a customer with valid identification?" "I have the authority to refuse any transaction I deem suspicious," Derek said. "And I find this entire situation highly questionable. People like you trying to cash checks this size, it always raises red flags in my experience." There it was again. "People like you, I see," Margaret said softly. She tucked her check and identification back into her briefcase, taking her time with it. Then she looked up at Derek with that same small smile from before. "Well, Mr. Patterson, thank you for showing me exactly how this branch operates. It's been very educational." Something in her tone made Derek's triumphant expression falter just for a second, but then he recovered, straightening his shoulders. "We take security seriously here at First National Trust," he said pompously. "I can see that," Margaret replied. She walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing slightly on the polished floor. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back. Derek was already heading back to his office, probably to tell someone else about his victory. Margaret pushed through the glass doors into the afternoon sunlight. The heat hit her immediately after the bank's air conditioning, but she didn't mind. She walked to her car, got in, and sat there for a moment, thinking. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call. "Susan? It's Margaret." "Yes, I just finished the last branch visit. We need to schedule an emergency meeting with HR and legal. Tomorrow morning, if possible. I'll send you the details tonight, but let's just say Branch 5 is going to need some immediate management changes." She ended the call and started her car. Derek Patterson had no idea what was coming, but he was about to learn a very important lesson about assumptions, about prejudice, and about the danger of underestimating people. Margaret drove away from First National Trust Bank with her check still undeposited, but not for long. Derek Patterson woke up Wednesday morning feeling pretty good about himself. He'd showered, shaved, picked out his best suit, the charcoal gray one with the subtle pinstripe that made him look sharp. As he knotted his tie in the bathroom mirror, he replayed yesterday's events in his head and smiled. That woman with the suspicious check. He'd handled that perfectly, he thought, protected the bank from what was obviously some kind of scam. Sure, she'd seemed calm and collected, but that was probably part of the act. Scammers were getting better these days, more sophisticated. But Derek prided himself on being able to spot them. His wife was already downstairs making coffee when he came down. "Big day?" she asked, handing him a mug. "Just another day keeping the bank safe," Derek said, taking a sip. He'd told her about the incident last night over dinner, painting himself as the vigilant manager who'd stopped a fraud attempt. She'd seemed distracted, scrolling through her phone while he talked, but that was normal these days. The drive to the bank took 20 minutes. Derek sang along with the radio, tapped his fingers on the steering wheel at red lights. It was a beautiful morning, clear sky, not too hot yet. The kind of day that made you feel like everything was going right. He pulled into his reserved parking spot at 8:45, 15 minutes before the bank opened. Early as always. That's what separated good managers from great ones, he liked to think. Dedication, attention to detail. Inside, the morning crew was already there. Stephanie was restocking brochures at the information desk. 2 other tellers were counting their starting cash drawers. The security guard, old Howard, was doing his usual rounds, checking that all the doors and windows were secure. "Morning. Everyone?" Derek called out as he walked through the lobby. A few people mumbled greetings back, but nobody seemed particularly enthusiastic. Derek didn't notice. He was already thinking about his coffee, about getting settled at his desk, about checking his emails. His office was in the back, behind the teller line. Glass walls on 2 sides so he could see out into the lobby. Important for security, for keeping an eye on things. He liked this office. It was small, but it was his, and the glass walls made him feel important, like a ship captain on the bridge watching over his crew. Derek set down his briefcase, powered up his computer, and waited for it to boot up. While he waited, he straightened the family photo on his desk. Him, his wife, their 2 kids from a vacation 3 years ago. Everyone smiling. He should probably update that soon. The computer chimed to life. Derek logged in and pulled up his email, expecting the usual. Corporate memos, customer service reminders, maybe a note from his regional manager about last month's numbers. Instead, the first email made him pause. It was from Susan Chen, the regional director. Subject line, urgent, mandatory video conference, 10 a.m. today. Derek frowned. Mandatory? That was unusual. He opened the email. "Derek, please join the attached video conference at 10 a.m. sharp. This is time-sensitive and required. Attendance is not optional." Susan, that was it. No explanation. No hint about what the meeting was about. Derek felt a small flutter of nervousness in his stomach, but he pushed it away. Probably just some new corporate policy they needed to roll out. Or maybe quarterly review stuff. Nothing to worry about. He spent the next hour doing his usual morning routine. Checked the teller drawers, reviewed yesterday's transactions, responded to a few customer emails. At 9:30, Stephanie knocked on his glass door. "Hey, I'm Derek." She looked uncomfortable. "Hey, can I ask you something about yesterday? The fraud attempt?" Derek leaned back in his chair. "What about it?" Stephanie shifted her weight from foot to foot. "I was just wondering, did you ever actually call to verify that check from the woman with the property management company?" Derek waved his hand dismissively. "Didn't need to. It was clearly fraudulent. You could tell just by looking at her." "Looking at her?" Stephanie's voice went up slightly. "You know what I mean. Someone like that doesn't just walk in with a $47,000 check. Come on, Stephanie. You've got to develop better instincts for this stuff. Stephanie opened her mouth like she wanted to say something else, then seemed to think better of it. Okay, she said quietly. I was wondering. She left and Derek shook his head. Young people these days, too trusting. That's why they needed experienced managers like him to protect them from making mistakes. At 9:55, Derek clicked on the video conference link. His screen filled with a waiting room message. He was the first one there. Good. Punctuality was important. At exactly 10 o'clock, the waiting room disappeared and suddenly Derek was looking at 4 faces on his screen. His confidence wavered immediately. Susan Chen was there, the regional director. But she wasn't alone. Next to her was Robert Chen, the bank's chief operating officer, the COO, one of the highest-ranking people in the entire company. On the other side was Patricia Williams from Human Resources, and next to her was someone Derek didn't recognize but whose title said Corporate Legal Counsel. This wasn't a routine meeting. Derek's mouth went dry. Good morning, Derek, Susan said. Her face was serious, professional, not unfriendly, but definitely not warm. Thank you for joining us on short notice. Of course, Derek managed. Happy to be here. Derek, we need to discuss an incident that occurred at your branch yesterday. Specifically, an incident involving a customer named Margaret Williams. The name didn't register immediately. Derek's mind was racing, trying to figure out what this was about. Margaret Williams? He didn't know any. Oh, the woman with the check. You mean the fraud attempt? Derek said, and he could hear the relief in his own voice. Yes, I was actually planning to write up a report about that. I stopped what could have been a major security breach. A woman came in with a clearly suspicious check. Derek! Susan's voice cut through his explanation like a knife. That woman owns this bank. The words didn't make sense. Derek heard them, but they bounced off his brain like water off glass. I'm sorry, what? Robert Chen leaned forward on the screen. He was maybe 60, with gray hair and the kind of calm authority that came from decades in banking. Margaret Williams is the majority shareholder of First National Trust Bank. She purchased the entire institution 3 months ago through Summit Equity Partners. Derek felt like the floor had dropped. Out from under his chair. That can't be right. It's absolutely right, Susan said. Ms. Williams has been conducting unannounced visits to each of our branches to evaluate operations, customer service, and adherence to our policies. She came to your branch yesterday specifically to observe how you and your team handle customers. The room was spinning. Derek gripped the edge of his desk. But she didn't say. I mean, how was I supposed to know? Patricia from HR spoke up for the first time. Her voice was cool, professional. You weren't supposed to know. Derek, that was the entire point. Ms. Williams wanted to see how the bank operates when employees think no one important is watching. We've reviewed the security footage from your branch, Susan continued. All of it. And we've also reviewed a recording that Ms. Williams made on her phone during the interaction. A recording. Derek felt sick. Robert Chen pulled out a tablet, glanced at it. Let me make sure I understand what happened. Ms. Williams came in to deposit a legitimate business check. She provided her account number, her identification, and explained that the check was from her property management company. Is that correct? Derek nodded mutely. And your response was to question her repeatedly, refuse to verify the check, make loud comments about fraud in front of other customers, and ultimately have security escort her to the waiting area before refusing to process her deposit entirely. Is that also correct? I was following security protocols, Derek said, but his voice sounded weak even to himself. What security protocols? Patricia asked. Please cite the specific policy that required you to refuse service to a customer with valid identification and a verifiable business check. Derek's mouth opened and closed. It's judgment-based. As branch manager, I have the authority. You have the authority to protect the bank from fraud, Susan interrupted. You do not have the authority to discriminate against customers based on your personal assumptions. I wasn't discriminating. I would have done the same thing for anyone. Would you? Robert Chen's voice was quiet but sharp. Because we also reviewed footage of the same time period. At the window next to Ms. Williams, another customer, a white woman, deposited a check for $52,000. The teller processed it in under 3 minutes with no manager intervention. Can you explain that discrepancy? Derek couldn't. His brain had gone blank. Susan's face filled his screen. Derek, you never once attempted to verify Ms. Williams' check. You never called her property management company, never looked up her business registration, never did any actual investigation. You simply assumed, based on her appearance, that she was attempting fraud. That's not... I didn't... Derek stammered. You told your teller, and I quote from the audio recording, you could tell just by looking at her. What exactly could you tell by looking at her, Derek? The silence that followed was crushing. Patricia from HR pulled up her own notes. Let me be very clear about what happened yesterday. You violated our non-discrimination policy. You violated our customer service standards. You failed to follow proper verification procedures. And you created a hostile environment for a customer based on what we can only conclude were assumptions related to her race. I never mentioned race, Derek protested. You didn't have to, Robert Chen said quietly. Your actions spoke clearly enough. Derek felt his career crumbling around him. Look, I made a mistake, okay? I didn't know who she was. If you'd known she owned the bank, you would have treated her differently, Susan finished. Yes, Derek, that's exactly the problem. You should treat every customer with respect and professionalism, regardless of who they are. I can fix this, Derek said desperately. I'll apologize. I'll take some training. Patricia from HR shook her head. Derek, this isn't your first incident. We've had 3 complaints about your behavior in the past 18 months. 2 from customers who felt they were treated dismissively, and 1 from an employee who said you created an uncomfortable work environment. We gave you warnings. We offered training. We gave you opportunities to improve. Derek remembered those complaints. He'd dismissed them at the time. Oversensitive people. Everyone was too politically correct these days. That's what he'd thought. So what are you saying? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Susan's face was professionally neutral, but her voice was firm. Derek Patterson, your employment with First National Trust Bank is terminated effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks of severance pay, and HR will contact you about the details of your exit. The words hit like a physical blow. You're firing me? Yes, Patricia said simply. Someone from HR will arrive at your branch within the hour to oversee the transition. Please gather your personal belongings. You'll need to surrender your keys, access cards, and any bank property before you leave. This is insane. Derek's voice rose. 1 mistake and you're just going to throw away 7 years? I've been a good manager. My numbers are solid. You can't. We absolutely can, Robert Chen said. And we are. This decision is final, Derek. What about Ms. Williams? Susan asked, and her tone had changed slightly. Would you like to know what she said about you? Derek didn't answer. Susan continued anyway. She said you were a symptom of a larger problem. She said that 1 bad manager was less concerning than a system that allowed that manager to operate for 7 years without meaningful oversight. She said she didn't want you punished. She wanted the bank to be better. That somehow made it worse. Derek would have preferred anger, accusations, demands for his head. This calm assessment of him as a symptom was more humiliating than any rage could have been. The video conference will end now, Patricia said. Again, HR will be there shortly. Please don't make this difficult, Derek. The screen went black. Derek sat in his office, staring at the blank monitor. Through the glass walls, he could see Stephanie at her window, helping a customer. She glanced toward his office, caught his eye, and quickly looked away. She knew. Somehow she already knew. Derek looked around his office. 7 years in this branch. 4 years as manager before that at another location. He'd thought he was good at his job. Thought he was protecting the bank, serving customers, doing everything right. How had he gotten it so wrong? His hands were shaking as he opened his desk drawer and pulled out the cardboard box he used to store extra office supplies. He dumped out the pens and sticky notes and started filling it with his personal items. The family photo. His coffee mug that said "World's Best Boss," ironic now. A few books. Some certificates from corporate training courses he'd taken over the years. It all fit in one small box. Through the glass, he saw a woman in a business suit enter the bank. She walked with purpose, spoke briefly to Stephanie, and headed straight for his office. HR, probably. Derek stood up, straightened his tie out of habit, and picked up his box. As he walked out of his office for the last time, Stephanie was watching. So was Howard the security guard. So were the other tellers. Everyone knew now. Word spread fast in a bank this size. The woman from HR extended her hand. Mr. Patterson? I'm Claire from Human Resources. If you'll come with me, we can take care of the exit paperwork. Derek followed her to a small conference room, signed papers he barely read, handed over his keys, his access card, his bank ID. 20 minutes later, he was walking out the front door with his cardboard box. His car was still in his reserved spot. For now. Tomorrow, that spot would belong to whoever replaced him. Derek sat in the driver's seat, the box on the passenger side, and stared at the bank through his windshield. Yesterday morning, he'd been a branch manager, confident and secure. Today, he was unemployed, and all because he'd looked at a woman with a check and made assumptions. All because he'd seen what he expected to see instead of what was actually in front of him. Derek started his car and drove away from First National Trust Bank for the last time. He still didn't really understand what he'd done wrong, but he was beginning to realize that maybe that was the biggest problem of all. The morning after Derek's termination, Stephanie arrived at the bank 30 minutes early. She'd barely slept the night before, replaying everything that had happened over the past 2 days. The woman with the check, Derek's reaction, the way he'd been escorted out yesterday by HR, and the rumors. Oh, the rumors were flying. By the time Stephanie had left work yesterday, everyone knew the basics. That woman Derek had refused to serve, she owned the entire bank, the whole thing. And now Derek was gone. Stephanie had gone home and immediately looked up Margaret Williams online, found articles about her in business journals: real estate developer, property investor, philanthropist. One article from 5 years ago talked about how she'd built her fortune from nothing, starting with a single rental property and growing it into an empire. And Derek had treated her like a criminal. Stephanie felt sick thinking about her own role in it. She'd been the one to get Derek. She'd been nervous about the check too, hadn't she? She'd gone along with everything, stood there while Derek humiliated that woman, hadn't said a word in her defense. Now, standing in the employee entrance of the bank, Stephanie wondered if she still had a job. Inside, the bank felt different, quieter somehow, even though it was just the usual morning routine. Howard, the security guard, was at his post. The other tellers were getting ready for the day. But there was a tension in the air, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. At 9:30, the front doors were unlocked. The first few customers trickled in. Everything seemed normal. Then, at 10 o'clock, a black town car pulled up outside the bank. Stephanie watched through the window as the driver came around and opened the back door. Margaret Williams stepped out. She was wearing a sharp gray suit today, her hair pulled back, carrying that same worn leather briefcase. But something about her presence was different now. More confident, more purposeful. She wasn't pretending to be just another customer anymore. With Margaret were 2 other people. A woman in her 40s with a professional demeanor and a younger man carrying a laptop bag. Stephanie's heart started pounding as they walked through the front doors. The entire bank seemed to freeze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Tellers paused in their counting. Everyone was staring. Margaret looked around the lobby slowly, taking everything in. Then her eyes found Stephanie behind the teller window. She walked over. Stephanie felt her mouth go dry. "Ms. Williams," she managed. "I'm so sorry about..." Margaret held up her hand gently. "Is there somewhere private we can talk? You, me, and the rest of the staff?" "There's the conference room," Stephanie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the back? Perfect. Could you gather everyone? This won't take long." 10 minutes later, the entire branch staff was crammed into the small conference room. 7 people total now that Derek was gone. Everyone looked nervous, Stephanie most of all. Margaret stood at the head of the table. The woman who'd come with her, who introduced herself as Susan Chen, regional director, stood beside her. The young man set up his laptop and stayed quiet. "Good morning, everyone," Margaret began. Her voice was calm, measured, not angry but serious. "I know the past couple of days have been confusing and stressful. I want to clear some things up." She paused, making eye contact with each person in the room. "My name is Margaret Williams, and 3 months ago, I became the majority owner of First National Trust Bank. Before I announced myself publicly, I wanted to visit each branch as a regular customer, to see how we really operate when no one thinks the owner is watching." Stephanie watched her, unable to look away. What happened here on Tuesday was unacceptable, Margaret continued. I came in to make a simple deposit. I had valid identification, a legitimate business check, and an account at this branch, and I was treated like a criminal. Questioned, humiliated, refused service. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Derek Patterson's employment has been terminated, but I want to be very clear about something. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about one bad manager. It's about a bigger problem. Margaret pulled out a chair and sat down, making herself level with everyone else. It was a subtle gesture, but Stephanie noticed it. The problem is that what Derek did to me happens every day to people who look like me. At banks, at stores, at restaurants, people make assumptions based on how someone looks, how they dress, the color of their skin, and those assumptions hurt people. They drive away customers. They create environments where people don't feel welcome. She looked directly at Stephanie. You're not being fired. But I need you to understand something. When you went to get Derek on Tuesday, you were following protocol for large deposits. That's fine. But what happened after that? You stood there while he questioned me, while he made a spectacle of the situation, while he refused to verify the check. You didn't say anything. Stephanie felt tears prick her eyes. I know, I'm so sorry. You should have what? Margaret asked, not unkindly. Challenged your manager? Gone against his authority? That's hard to do, especially when you're young and you need your job. I understand that. She addressed the whole room again. That's why this can't just be about firing one person. We need to change the culture. The system. We need to create an environment where staff feel empowered to speak up when something's wrong. Susan Chen stepped forward. Starting next week, every employee at every branch will undergo comprehensive training. Implicit bias, cultural competency, customer service excellence. It's not optional, it's mandatory. Margaret nodded. We're also implementing new policies. Anonymous feedback systems so customers can report concerns without fear. Regular audits of our service records, checking for patterns of discrimination. Mystery shoppers to evaluate how we treat different types of customers. The young man with the laptop spoke up for the first time. We'll also be looking at our hiring practices, our promotion criteria, our complaint procedures, everything. This bank, Margaret said, standing up again, is going to be different. We're going to serve every customer with dignity and respect, regardless of what they look like, how much money they have, or where they come from. We're going to be the kind of bank that builds communities up instead of pushing people out. She pulled out her briefcase and, with a small smile, took out a familiar piece of paper. The check. The same one Derek had refused to process. Stephanie, Margaret said, would you mind processing this for me now? Stephanie stood up so fast she almost knocked over her chair. Yes, ma'am, absolutely, right away. They walked out to the teller window together. The other customers in the bank watched with open curiosity as Stephanie logged into her terminal, with shaking hands. Margaret handed over the check. Just a standard deposit, please. Of course. Stephanie took the check, scanned it, entered the amount. $47,000. The transaction went through in less than a minute. Thank you, Margaret said. That wasn't so hard, was it? No, ma'am. Stephanie printed out the deposit slip and handed it over. Margaret took it, glanced at it, then looked back at Stephanie. I want you to know something. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what we do after. Do we learn? Do we grow? Do we do better? I want to do better, Stephanie said, and she meant it with her whole heart. Good, because I'm going to need people like you to help rebuild this bank's culture. People who care enough to want to change. Over the next hour, Margaret walked through the entire branch with Susan. They examined procedures, asked questions, took notes. She spoke with every employee individually, asking about their experiences, their concerns, their ideas for improvement. Around noon, Margaret ordered lunch for everyone, sandwiches from a local deli, not some corporate catering service. They ate together in the break room, and Margaret told stories about her early days in business. The struggles, the failures, the small victories that eventually led to bigger ones. When I bought my first rental property, she said, I was 29 years old and scared out of my mind. The bank that gave me the loan made me jump through hoops. I had to provide twice as much documentation as other borrowers, had to have a cosigner even though my credit was perfect, had to pay a higher interest rate. She took a bite of her sandwich. At the time, I was just grateful to get the loan at all. But looking back, I know what was happening. They didn't believe in me, didn't trust me, made assumptions about whether I could succeed. What happened with that property? Howard, the security guard, asked. He'd been quiet all morning, but now he seemed genuinely curious. Margaret smiled. I fixed it up, rented it out, never missed a payment. Sold it 5 years later for 3 times what I paid. Used that profit to buy 2 more properties, then 4, then 10. Built it into a whole business. Williams Property Management, Stephanie said quietly. Exactly. The same company whose check Derek refused to believe was real. Margaret laughed, but there was no bitterness in it. The irony isn't lost on me. After lunch, Margaret spent another 2 hours at the branch. She sat with customers in the lobby, introducing herself, asking about their experiences with the bank. Some were thrilled to meet her. Others were cautious, waiting to see if this new ownership would actually change anything. One older woman, Mrs. Chen, pulled Margaret aside. I've been banking here for 30 years, she said. I watched this place change. Used to be friendly, personal. Last few years it's felt cold. Like they didn't really want us here unless we had a lot of money. That's going to change, Margaret promised. I can't fix everything overnight, but I'm committed to making this bank serve everyone in this community. Mrs. Chen studied her face. You mean that, don't you? I absolutely do. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret gathered the staff one more time. I know you're wondering about Derek's position, she said. Who's going to be the new branch manager? Everyone leaned forward slightly. We'll be conducting interviews over the next few weeks. We're looking for someone who understands this community, who shares our values, who can lead with empathy and integrity. If any of you are interested in applying, please do. We believe in promoting from within when we can. Stephanie felt a flutter of something. Not quite hope, but possibility. She'd never thought about being a manager before, but maybe someday. In the meantime, Margaret continued, Susan will be overseeing operations here until we find the right person. She'll be here a few days a week, and you can always reach her by phone or email. Susan nodded. My door is always open. Questions, concerns, ideas, I want to hear them all. At 4:30, Margaret prepared to leave. She shook hands with each staff member, thanked them for their time and their willingness to embrace change. When she got to Stephanie, she paused. I'm going to be watching this branch closely, not because I don't trust you all, but because I believe you can be an example for the other branches. Show them what's possible when we get it right. We'll do our best, Stephanie said. I know you will. Margaret walked out of the bank back to the town car waiting at the curb. But before she got in, she turned back and looked at the building. The sign above the door, First National Trust Bank. Her bank now. She'd bought it because she believed in second chances. Believed that institutions could change, could be better. Believed that the financial system should work for everyone, not just people who already had wealth. What happened with Derek was unfortunate, but it had shown her exactly what needed to change. And now she had the power to change it. The driver opened the door. Margaret slid into the back seat. Where to, Ms. Williams? The downtown office, she said. We have a lot of work to do. As the car pulled away, Stephanie watched from the window. She thought about the woman Derek had dismissed, had humiliated, had underestimated. That woman now owned the bank. That woman was going to change everything. And Stephanie was going to make sure she never forgot the lesson of these past few days. Never judge people by how they look. Never make assumptions about what they're capable of. Never let prejudice, subtle or obvious, go unchallenged. She turned back to her teller window where a customer was waiting with a deposit. Good afternoon, Stephanie said with a genuine smile. How can I help you today? And she meant it. She really meant it. Things were going to be different now. Better. Starting right here, right now, with every single customer who walked through those doors. 3 months had passed since that Tuesday afternoon when Margaret Williams walked into the downtown branch with a check and walked out knowing exactly what needed to change. Now, on a crisp November morning, she sat in her office on the 15th floor of the bank's headquarters building, looking out over the city. The view was impressive. She could see all the way to the river. But Margaret had never been one to spend much time admiring views. There was too much work to do. Her desk was covered with reports, customer satisfaction surveys, branch performance metrics, training completion records, employee feedback forms. She'd been reading them since 6 this morning, and it was now almost 9. Her assistant, Beverly, knocked on the open door. Your 9 o'clock is here. Conference room B. Thanks, Bev, I'll be right there. Margaret gathered her papers and headed down the hall. This was a meeting she'd been looking forward to, the quarterly review with all the branch managers. The first one since the changes had been implemented. The conference room was already full when she arrived. 23 branch managers, each representing a different location across the city and surrounding areas. Most of them she'd met during her surprise visits. A few were new hires brought in to replace managers who hadn't adapted well to the new policies. Susan Chen was already at the head of the table, pulling up a presentation on the big screen. She nodded to Margaret, who took a seat near the middle of the table rather than at the head. Another deliberate choice. She wanted this to feel like a conversation, not a lecture. "Good morning, everyone," Susan began. "Thanks for making the trip downtown. We have a lot to cover today, but I want to start with the numbers." She clicked to the first slide, customer satisfaction scores. The graph showed a clear upward trend over the past 3 months. "Overall customer satisfaction is up 18% across all branches," Susan said. "That's significant. But what's even more interesting is where those improvements are coming from." The next slide broke it down by demographic. The increases were highest among minority customers, young customers, and customers in lower-income neighborhoods. "These are the customers we were losing," Margaret said quietly, "the ones who felt like we didn't want their business. And now they're coming back." One of the managers, a woman named Linda who'd been with the bank for 15 years, raised her hand. "I've noticed that at my branch too. We had a customer last week who told me she'd switched to another bank 2 years ago because she felt unwelcome here. But she heard we'd changed, so she came back to give us another chance." "Did you keep her?" Margaret asked. Linda smiled. "Not only did we keep her, she referred 3 friends. They all opened accounts last Thursday." There was a murmur of approval around the table. Margaret made a note on her paper. "Good news, but they couldn't get complacent." Susan clicked to the next slide. "Training completion is at 98%. The remaining 2% are new hires still in their first week. Everyone has completed the implicit bias training, the customer service excellence program, and the cultural competency course." A younger manager, Thomas, spoke up. "I'll be honest, when we first got the training announcement, some of my staff groaned. They thought it would be boring corporate stuff. But the feedback I've gotten has actually been really positive. People said it made them think about things they'd never considered before." "That's exactly what we wanted," Margaret said. "Awareness is the first step. Action is the second." Susan moved to the next slide. Mystery shopper results. First National Trust had hired an independent firm to send people into branches, people of different races, ages, income levels, to see how they were treated. The results were color-coded. Green for excellent service, yellow for acceptable, red for problematic. Most of the results were green. A few yellows. Only 2 reds. "The 2 red flags have been addressed," Susan said. "One was a teller who was having a bad day and was short with a customer. We've had a conversation with her about professionalism. The other was a more serious issue, a loan officer who seemed to apply different standards based on the customer's appearance. That employee is no longer with us." Margaret noticed the managers paying close attention. They understood that accountability was real now. This wasn't just talk.